Let me go ahead and...
Let's say go camping about 2 months.
Hello, and welcome to Meditation 3 of Descartes. Okay, so in this meditation, Descartes is basically going to use the cogito, the statement, I think, therefore I am, as a standard of truth that we can use in order to establish other knowledge. So the best way to think about this is basically to say that the method of radical skepticism led us to the cogito. And now that we have gotten to the cogito, we can't really do anything else with the method of radical skepticism. So what we're going to do now is to use the cogito in order to come up with a standard for truth that we can then use in order to establish other truths. Okay? So we began meditation 3 by remembering that we've at least established the one truth, that is to say, I think, therefore I am, right? The moment that I try to doubt my own existence, I'm left holding the bag, who's doing the doubting? I am, therefore I must exist as a mind. Please note that Descartes has not yet shown that I exist as a body. That's actually not going to happen until the big finale of meditation 6. So for now, what I do know is that as long as I am able to think, then on the basis of that, I can come to the conclusion that I exist. Now, quickly, does my thinking cause my existence?
It's a realization.
No, it's more of a realization. That's a good way to put it. So the idea is, presumably, I came into existence prior to thinking, or perhaps at the same time. I can't really be certain as to how I came into existence. But when I notice that I'm thinking, I can immediately, on the basis of that knowledge, come to the conclusion that I must exist. Okay? So that's not a temporal or a causal chain, it's a knowledge chain. Okay? In logic, we would talk about it in terms of the conditional is a truth functional operator. So what that means is that on the basis of the knowledge that I am thinking, I can come to the conclusion of the knowledge that I exist. But it's not causal. Okay, so on the basis of the cogito, we're going to try to figure out what else we can know. And the way that I want you to think about this is from the perspective that the cogito is a sample of truth. Okay, so imagine that you were in a geology class and your teacher showed you, your professor showed you some rocks, and on the basis of those rocks said, okay, now here's this other rock that you've never seen before. Tell me what type of rock is it? You know, is it amorphous or some other type of rock? What you would do is you would say, okay, I'm going to analyze the properties of this rock and figure out if it's like some other rock that I've studied. And if it's like some other rock that I've studied, then most likely it'll turn out to be the same type. So Descartes is doing a similar sort of analysis here. What he's saying is, look at the cogito, the statement, I think, therefore I am. And I realize that when I think it clearly and distinctly. Now, what precisely Descartes means by clearly and distinctly has been debated pretty much since he wrote it. But for sure, what we can understand is that he has in mind the way that the mind grasps the idea or judgment. So when I grasp it in a way that I cannot be mistaken without self-contradiction, then I am thinking it clearly and distinctly. Okay? Now, that can't be sense perception, right? Because when I look out the window and I say, there's a tree outside, can I be certain that there's a tree outside?
Not really.
No, why not?
Could be a painting.
Could be a painting. It could be a hologram. I could be trapped in the matrix. The evil genius could be piping these ideas into me as a mind in a bottle, right? And by the way, as we talk about the word mind, please understand that Descartes is going to use mind and soul interchangeably, but those are both different from any sort of brain process. Because at this point, I'm still doubting whether the body exists, So the mind is a non-physical agent. It lacks what Descartes would call extension. So it has no length, no width, no color, no size, no mass, right? It is a non-physical entity. But nevertheless, I know that it exists clearly and distinctly. Now, when my mind attempts to ascertain whether there is a tree outside or not, I can't know the tree's existence clearly and distinctly. And if you think through the wax example in Meditation 1, I think that's even clearer to understand, right? Because there's this idea that the wax changes and I can't really understand the essence of the wax. And, if you see liquid wax, would you know that it also represented solid wax? So whatever we learn from the senses cannot be understood clearly and distinctly. Okay. So the strategy that Descartes is going to use here is basically to show that God exists. And because God exists, God would not allow the evil genius to come into existence. And that's going to be a major component of making his argument work. And I would just like to take a moment to congratulate Descartes on his strategy here. Because you'll recall that what Descartes is trying to do is also protect himself from the church, right? And his strategy is going to be to show that the only way that scientific inquiry is possible is through God's existence, which will certify our sense knowledge and sense perception, which is necessary in order to make scientific inquiry work. And I find that to be just aesthetically really beautiful. From the perspective of telling the church, look, you shouldn't be against science. Science is only possible contingent upon the existence of God to verify our sense perception. Therefore, anything that science tells us is only going to be furthering the glory of God, not taking away from the glory of God. Smooth move, right? Of course, some of you are going to check out at the end of the second meditation. You're not going to believe Descartes' proofs for the existence of God. And if that's the case, then you believe that Descartes is caught in solipsism. This idea that all we're really ever able to prove is my own existence and not the existence of anyone else. And it is a little bit of a circuitous route because Descartes is going to prove God's existence. Then on the basis of God existing, he's going to allow us to have some use of our sense perception. And then ultimately he's going to show that our ideas of objects are right and good. And then on the basis of our ideas of objects being right and good, then he's going to show that actual physical objects exist. Okay, so we need to show that God exists in order to show that God would not make me a mind in a bottle and would not allow an evil genius to exist that would be capable of deceiving me in a way that I can't overcome. Okay? There's a difference between being deceived in a way that I can tell eventually. But the idea here is that God would not allow me to be deceived in a way that I would never be able to tell. So if you think back to the movie The Matrix, if you're stuck in the Matrix, do you have any way of knowing that you're in the Matrix?
Deja vu.
Well, deja vu is explained as a glitch in the Matrix, but you wouldn't necessarily be certain just because you've experienced deja vu that you're living in the Matrix, right? So if you're living in the Matrix, and let's say for the sake of argument, you've never experienced deja vu, would you have any way of knowing that you're in the Matrix? No. And I remember coming out of that movie, granted I was a little younger, but I remember seeing it in the theaters and thinking to myself, oh my goodness, I really could be in the Matrix? And has it gotten to the point where our masters are so good that they don't even mind telling us, right? I guess I was, I think 14 or 15 when the Matrix came out. And you can do the math, right, as to how old that makes me. But anyway, so getting back to Descartes, what Descartes is going to do is to say, okay, we have the cogito, and we know for sure that it is true. So let's try to use it as a standard for truth that we can apply to other truths. If it turns out that we know those other truths clearly and distinctly, then we can be certain that they are also true. And those aren't going to be truths that we understand through sense perception, so they must be something else. Now, the example that's used in your lecture notes here, I think, is really good. So imagine that you are in a hall of mirrors at the carnival, right? And there's those mirrors out there that make you look really, really huge. And then there are the ones that make you look really, really skinny, and the ones that make you look like you're upside down or sideways or whatever. So imagine that right after you win the ring toss, you see a monster chasing you through the hall of mirrors. And you think, oh my goodness, this monster is trying to steal my ring. Now, you're thinking to yourself, okay, is the monster bigger or smaller than I am? If the monster is smaller than I am, then chances are I can fight him off and keep my ring. But if the monster is larger than I am, then maybe I need to run away. So you think, okay, I'm going to hide behind one of the mirrors and look in another and see how big the monster is, except that all the mirrors are distorted. So if you just look in the mirror, you're not going to be able to tell whether the monster is bigger or smaller than you, right? So what could you do in that situation?
Break the mirrors.
How is breaking the mirror going to help you?
You just get a good look at it and run.
Other than give you 7 years of bad luck, right? How is that going to help you? Well, what you could do is take off your ring and use it to sketch out an outline of yourself. And I'm a really bad artist, but that's me with a hat.
Looks like jail box in super jail.
All right, my chalkboard art is awful, so just don't make fun of it. But you can see that that's sort of the general outline of me, right? So you take your ring and you sketch that out. And then if you hide behind another mirror, when you see the reflection of the monster, if the monster is bigger than you, then the monster in the reflection will also be bigger than you. And if it's smaller than you, then even the monster in the reflection is going to be smaller than you, right? So similarly, what we're going to do is look at the cogito and use it as a standard for truth. And we're going to be able to hold up other truths to it and say, is this at least as true as the cogito? Or is it not as true as the cogito? Good so far? Okay. Now, Descartes is going to basically tell us, let's sort our ideas on the basis of their apparent source. Where did I come to have these ideas? And he's been doing this all along, right? Because all of the ideas that we gathered from sense perception in Meditation 1, we threw out the window. So part of the problem is I cannot be certain that my ideas originate outside of me, right? So although I believe that there's a tree outside, I can't be certain that that's because there really is a tree outside of me that is causing me to have this idea of the tree. Or something else might be going on. I could be in the Matrix, I could be hallucinating, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I could be dreaming, right? The evil genius could be piping these ideas into my mind, etc. So Nevertheless, I can see that some of my ideas involve existence in a way that is greater or lesser, contingent upon what the idea actually is. So when I say something like swans are white, there's a way in which the swan itself exists more than the whiteness, right? Whiteness is a property that is in the swan, but the swan itself exists. And it might be helpful to think back to Aristotle and the four-parted square, where he's talking about the difference between in and set of, right? So we're talking about the in relation here. Now, Descartes' claim is going to be that when I look in my mind, I find certain things there, right? We've talked about this idea that my mind has thoughts in it, and that it doesn't matter whether those thoughts are accurate or not, as long as thinking is occurring, I can know that I exist. So, in my mind, I find my own existence. And then Descartes claims that I also find the idea of God. Some of you may agree with that. You may say, yes, I can remember being a small child and always having an idea of God in my mind. Some of you might say, no, people tried to get me to believe in God, and this is just an idea that didn't stick in my head for whatever reason. Just was not something that I really believed in. But recall that Descartes is primarily concerned with attacks that are going to be coming from the church. Is the church going to disagree with an argument that says that all people have an innate idea of God in their mind? Probably not, right?
Have a chance.
But for us, we may end up disagreeing. And I would just remind you that if you're going to disagree with an argument, that's fine. But a necessary condition of disagreeing with it is that you've understood it first. So let's make sure that we understand the argument, and then if you decide, I'm just not going to agree with a word that Descartes says past meditation 2, that's certainly your own prerogative, okay? So Descartes' claim is that I find an idea of God in my mind, and in addition, that this idea involves more reality than my ideas of finite substances and qualities. So when I compare my idea of God to my idea of swans are white, I notice that my idea of God is more real. Or I think, well, is it more real? And Descartes is going to use a metaphysical principle here in order to make his argument work. And that metaphysical principle is going to be that the cause must be at least as real as the effect. Do you remember the movie Who Framed Roger Rabbit? Yeah? Okay. So you'll recall that basically the story is that Roger and Jessica Rabbit have escaped from the cartoon world, and they're now running around in the real world, right? So let's say, for the sake of argument, that Jessica Rabbit decided to do something not so femme fatale-like, and she was going to knit a sweater for Roger. What kind of sweater would Jessica knit? It would be a cartoon sweater, right? And am I going to be able to wear a cartoon sweater and have it keep me warm?
I don't think so.
No, because I'm a flesh and blood human being, right? So that is a way to illustrate this idea that the cause must be at least as real as the effect. So if you see, if Jessica says, oh, I needed you the sweater, Roger, but the sweater is made from real wool, then you're going to know that she's lying, because there's no way for the cartoon Jessica Rabbit to make a sweater that is out of real world wool. She could only make a cartoon wool sweater. So, on the basis of this example, I hope that you have come to accept this idea or this metaphysical principle that the cause is at least as real as the effect. So let's turn back to the idea of God, okay? By definition, God is a being that is supremely real. And this idea existing in my mind must be an effect of some cause. It must have come from somewhere. And since it is an effect, then its cause must be at least as real as the idea of a supreme being. And if its cause must be at least as real as the idea of God, the cause of the idea of God must be the supreme being. Since anything that is supremely real must be real, God must be real. In other words, God must exist. So we began with the concept of God as a supreme being, plus the metaphysical principle, the cause must be at least as real as the effect. And we come to the conclusion that, therefore, God must exist. And the concept of God, as we're going through and understanding this, is a concept that we grasp clearly and distinctly, so that we understand what is involved in the concept. The crux of this argument is that if the idea of God involves supreme reality, then this supreme reality must have been put in by some cause. But the only cause that is sufficiently real enough to have done that is God. So you might say, okay, well, could the evil genius have put the idea of God in my mind? On this view, no, because that would be like Jessica Rabbit knitting a real wool sweater. The evil genius is not real enough to have put the idea of a supremely real being in my mind. Now, you might say, well, wait a minute, what if human beings came up with the concept of God and me talking to you about it put that idea in your mind, right? You might make some sort of evolutionary argument about how human beings have long struggled with just how tiny and helpless they are, and how they can't predict things like floods and earthquakes and so on and so forth. And in order to believe that they had some sort of semblance of control over their lives, we invented this notion of God. And that way, if a flood happened, I could say, oh, I was bad, and because I was bad, God punished me by making a flood happen. And if I'm better in the future, then there won't be any floods, right? That gives me some sort of measure of control over floods as a process, when this is at a time that science didn't have a way of explaining how floods occurred. Well, even if you gave Descartes this kind of evolutionary argument, which, by the way, some people do find to be persuasive. We've shown psychologically that children, for example, will try to take control or responsibility over a situation even when it can't possibly be their responsibility. So, for example, if a small child's parents divorce, the child will say things like, oh, please get back together. I promise that I'll be good. I won't do anything wrong ever again, as though the child's misbehavior were the cause of the divorce. Even though we can all agree that no matter how much a child misbehaves, that's not going to cause parents to split up. But the child wants to have control over that situation. And so to a certain extent, we take on guilt that isn't ours for the trade-off of having control. So the idea is that in the same way that a child does this because of limited understanding, that so too have human beings made similar arguments in our evolutionary past. But now that science can explain why there are floods, there's no reason for us to believe in the existence of a supreme being. And Descartes is not going to like this argument. He's going to say, look, for me to invent an idea, I must have had it within my power to manipulate the constituent parts of that idea, the building blocks, so to speak. So if I tell you that I'm writing a science fiction novel and the main character is a six-legged dragon with ethereal fairy wings that flies using teleportation, then in order for me to have invented that idea, I would need to be able to manipulate the constituent building blocks. So the notion of 6 legs, teleportation, fairy wings, in order to amalgamate them together into Puff, the teleporting dragon. And if I can't manipulate the building blocks, I can't get the job done of creating Puff, the teleporting dragon. And Descartes' argument is going to be that it's not possible for me to manipulate the building blocks of the concept of God because these are characteristics like infinite reality, right? God is supposed to be omnipresent, omniscient, all-knowing, omnipotent, all-powerful, and did I miss an omni? Omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, all-loving, and omnipresent. And am I capable of manipulating infinite power in order to combine it with infinite knowledge in order to create the concept of God? No. Okay. So think about it this way. My friend Nolan has been blind since birth. Now let's say for the sake of argument that Nolan wakes up tomorrow and when he's doing an inventory of everything that he knows, which is what he does every morning upon waking, we'll say, he finds that he now has knowledge of the color red in his mind. It does remind me a little bit of The Giver. Yeah. And by the way, you do know that that book is basically talking about Plato's forms, right? This idea that some people have access to Plato's forms and then, but not everybody should have access to Plato's forms, and that The Giver gives access to Plato's forms to the person that's receiving them. But it does sound a little bit like The Giver, right? There's a way in which Nolan, upon waking and finding that he has the color red in his mind, is going to say, well, someone must have given me the color red. And in addition, it must have been someone who is capable of experiencing the color red. This is not something that I could have dreamed. This is not something that I could have created, because he doesn't have access to the constituent parts of color in order to make that happen.
So, have you asked him, like, does he see things in his head and what?
I don't think Nolan's really blind, is he?
No, he is. I mean, I really do have a friend, Nolan, who is blind. I know that he's capable of conceptualizing space. So, for example, if you give him the idea of a circuit board, that he's able to figuring out this part of the circuit is higher than this other part of the circuit, because he can memorize directions to places. But in terms of being able to do so even with gradation of color, I want to say that that's not a possibility for him. Though I have heard of other people that are born blind sort of having this idea that some things are darker than others. So if they've had some access to visual stimulation, then they can sort of have this idea of dark versus light.
Yeah, I assume we're talking about true blind, not legal blind.
Right,
Yeah.
right. True blind. True blind. Whatever.
I know
That
it's
means,
funny,
yeah.
but some people can see
I will not make any jokes about legitimate rape. I promise. So, point being, if Nolan does wake up with the concept of red in his mind, he's going to know it had to be put there by someone else. And if he's been hosting Vulcans, then he might think, okay, some friendly Vulcan might have mind melded with me in order to put that idea in my mind. Or if he's been reading The Giver, then he might come to the conclusion that that would have happened. But no matter what, he's going to know there's no way for him to have invented the notion. It just couldn't be the case because he can't manipulate the constituent parts. So, analogously, the same line of thought applies to the concept of God. I am a finite mind, and therefore could not have manipulated the constituent parts of the concept of God any more than Nolan could manipulate the constituent parts of the concept read. And since I can't have created the idea of God, it must have come from outside my mind. But where? So you might say, well, wait a minute, it was my Sunday school teacher or my mom who taught me, okay, you put your hands together like this, and before you go to sleep, you pray. But she's a finite mind. So there's no way for her to have come up with the idea in order to give it to me either. For those of you that are starting to think that this rings bells of the argument from recollection, there's something structurally about it that does kind of resemble that. And the arguments for God's existence that Descartes uses, both in this meditation and especially in the next one, do definitely remind of Anselm's arguments, ontological arguments for God's existence. Descartes isn't going to give a reference or citation to Anselm, but at this point he's still doubting whether St. Anselm existed, so it would be illegitimate for him to give a citation. You can't use that as an excuse not to cite Descartes in your papers there. Okay. So this line of thought is sometimes nicknamed the Potter's Mark argument or the Maker's Mark argument because it basically makes the argument that God, upon creating you, left a signature, so to speak, a little mark of the idea of his existence in your mind. We can make some counter arguments here. I think the most obvious is to say, well, wait a minute, my idea of God, especially as a supreme being, is not clear and distinct at all. In fact, it seems a little fuzzy, right? When I try to wrap my head around this notion of God as being omnipotent, for example, that's kind of hard to get my head around. One of the traditional ways of phrasing the paradox is to say, could God make a rock so heavy that God can't lift it? If God can't make the rock, then he's not omnipotent, and if he can't lift it, then he's not omnipotent. Ha ha ha, therefore he must not be omnipotent. And usually the way that we get around that is to say, well, no, that's not God not being omnipotent. That's me as a finite mind not being able to understand omnipotence, which would play back into this idea that I can't manipulate the constituent parts. But nevertheless, it seems that our ideas of God are sort of confused. For those of you that grew up in a Judeo-Christian Muslim context, you're going to think of God as, I don't know, some guy with a really long beard living in the clouds somewhere who is watching me all the time, and as soon as I do something wrong, pulls the punishment lever, right? That's kind of the vague idea that we have of God. But Descartes is going to say, no, it is clear and distinct, and that we know God's attributes include infinite power, infinite knowledge, infinite love, and infinite presence. So then Descartes makes a really cute argument. It makes me giggle every time I teach the third meditations. He basically says, well, wait a minute, could it be possible that I invented the concept of God, but I just don't know that I invented it? And Descartes says, in order for that to be the case, I would have to be God. But I can doubt, therefore, I can't be God. Because God has infinite knowledge and therefore isn't going to be doing any doubting. The part of me that's a little skeptical about these things says, well, wait a minute, but if God is omnipotent, then isn't God capable of doubting? If God isn't capable of doubting, then that would seem like an argument against his omnipotence, but most people are going to answer that by saying that God is the sum of all perfections, right? And that perfect knowledge is part of that package.
His next point.
Pardon?
That's kind of like his next point.
Yeah, I mean, his next point is basically going to be that in order for me to have invented the idea of God, I must be God, but I doubt and have all sorts of epistemic problems. Therefore, I don't have perfect knowledge, and hence I'm not God. So if I were God, I wouldn't be involved in these meditations in the first place. I would just have perfect knowledge. Therefore, I must be a finite being, and the idea of God must have been put into my mind. Okay. So the next argument that Descartes is going to give us for the existence of God, this one reminds me a little bit of Aquinas's arguments. It's nicknamed the sustainer argument, but it basically says, I live in time, and I require assistance from outside of myself to continue living because I am finite, right? So I must have had to come from somewhere, and I must also be sustained. And you can think of this from the perspective of a light bulb. So if a light bulb is on, you know that the power must be going to it. And if the light bulb is off, then you might wonder, okay, is the power out or has the bulb shorted? But either way, you're going to know that there's no power going to it. And it takes the same power to make a bulb glow another moment as it took to make the light bulb begin glowing in the first place. So the fact that I continue moving and continue living in order to be sustained. So in my case, the glow or existence requires the same input of energy that was required to start the process. In other words, the same power it took to create me. And who's going to have the power to create such awesomeness as myself?
God.
Only God. Okay. So on the basis of these lines of arguments, Descartes hopes to have demonstrated the existence of God. And then that's important for his argument because once we know that God exists, then we can dispense with the mind in a bottle story. It's dispelled, right? God, as the supreme being, is incapable of being that kind of deceiver. So that now leaves me able to apply the clearness and distinctness standard to other claims so that I can go on my way of building a firm and constant knowledge in the sciences as a foundation. So certainly one of the questions that we can ask at the end of the third meditation is to say, was this philosophically necessary for Descartes to prove the existence of God? Is that the only way that he could have gotten himself out of Cartesian solipsism? This idea that I can only show my own existence? Is the only way out of this problem to show God's existence? Or did Descartes do this as a more strategic point in order to avoid problems with the church?
I think he needed the argument of God to sustain himself. Otherwise, like he said, he couldn't get out of the bottle.
So there's a phrase that refers to using God to get yourself out of a jinx or a puzzle. And it's Deus ex machina. And Deus ex machina arguments are not considered to be the strongest kind of arguments. In general, we prefer to have another type of argument that explains what's going on. But Descartes could certainly make the claim, hey, in this particular case, God really is the only way that these things can occur, and it's not my fault that I can't provide another explanation. That just is the only explanation. But on the other hand, you may not necessarily be convinced. I wanted to give you another sort of counter argument that's not mentioned in the lecture notes. This is taken from Yoga, the Spirit and Practice of Moving into Stillness by Eric Skiffman. That's not by any stretch of the imagination the only place where you would find this kind of argument. It's pretty standard in Eastern philosophy, but it's basically this idea that each of us has a divine spark within us, and that core is a core of goodness and divinity. So the argument basically goes that you are you, God's specific self-expression, that God is an infinite being capable of infinite creation, and that you are the specific conscious expression of an infinitely expressive consciousness, mind, presence, or God. And that part of the process of meditation and of doing yoga is to get in touch with that core goodness. And basically the idea on this view is that we are unhappy insofar as we are separated from our understanding of our true nature. And that when we tune into it, which we can do by meditative practice or yogic practice, then we come to have peace. And as an extension of peace, we then have joy. And the reason I make this argument is because Descartes' counter-argument that because I can doubt I am not God has always really struck me as being particularly intriguing. And there is something to be said for, well, wait a minute, perhaps God is the source of infinite wisdom, infinite power, infinite goodness, and infinite presence. But that doesn't mean that I couldn't be a tiny little piece of God that was created in order to know God subjectively instead of God's knowledge, which is always objective. And if that's the case, then I could be God in a sense, but still be capable of doubting. And I bring this up too because sometimes it's a little frustrating the way that Descartes and all of these other authors talk about God, right? It's a very specific understanding of what it means to be a deity, and not all of you share that view. So I wanted to give you another narrative just to give you something else to think about. All right, I hope you enjoyed this streaming of Meditation 3.